Okay. Hello, everybody. My name's Katy Hayward. I'm from Queen's University, Belfast, and I'm delighted to have the honour to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon. Bernard Jenkin is the Member of Parliament for Harwich and North Essex, and he's been so since the 2010 general election. He was first elected to represent Colchester North in the 1992 general election. He was elected chairman of the Public Administration Select Committee in May 2010 and was deputy chairman of the Conservative Party. And this morning, quoted from Michael Headline's Wikipedia page, and I've taken the liberty of doing the same. I'm leaving out the more salacious parts, but I'm going to pick on one very interesting piece, which will be of particular interest to our audience today, I think, and that's that in 1987, you stood for election in Glasgow Central. And you did so, according to Wikipedia, to illustrate that people in the southeast haven't forgotten about Scotland. How did they respond? You don't have to answer. You may come with it. Bernard is a long-standing Eurosceptic, and he was one of the Maastricht rebels during the premiership of John Major. In the 2016 EU referendum, he supported Brexit, and since 2017 has been one of the most vocal supporters of the Eurosceptic pressure group, Leave Means Leave. Thank you very much for coming, Bernard. We look forward to hearing from you.
Well, Katy, thank you very much for that very restrained interpretation of my Wikipedia page. And how did I do in Scotland? I did, in fact, I was in second place, and I beat the SNP, who were in fourth place. And when I confronted Alex Salmond in the House of Commons a few years ago, it was greeted with great satisfaction from every other political party. And I gather you've had quite an interesting morning, and if I'm the double act with Michael Heseltine, I realise I can't compete with such a huge personality and a great figure of British politics. Because I'm chairman of a select committee, I'll try and be more impartial than a certain former head of the civil service who appeared before you this morning, much as I admire him and respect that he is entitled to his views. If I move on, does this work? That's the next question. Can everybody see? Am I in the way? Okay, is it okay? Right, well, since its inception in 1997, the UK's devolution settlement has been in a constant state of flux. 1997 was when the first referendums were held in Scotland and Wales, and voters chose to establish a Scottish Parliament and a Welsh National Assembly. The following year, in another referendum, voters in Northern Ireland endorsed the Belfast Agreement, which re-established the Stormont Parliament in Northern Ireland. Since then, devolution has increased, with particularly significant changes introduced by the Scotland Act in 2016 and the Wales Act in 2017. However, devolution has followed a different pattern and has moved at a different pace in each of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The devolution settlement in the UK is profoundly asymmetrical, with different systems and different powers in each of the devolved nations, and of course the fundamental problem that England dwarfs them all. In reaction to the vow made by David Cameron at the time of the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, English votes for English laws was introduced in 2015. In recent years, greater decentralisation has also been seen within England, with the Cities and Local Government Devolution Act of 2016, enabling the devolution of further powers to English cities and counties, and the introduction of elected mayors in combination authorities. These developments have taken place in the context of an ongoing debate about what devolution with England should look like and feel like. And personally, I'm very struck by how little we talk about, and I'm going to be guilty of this again today, how little we talk about how much in common parts of England have with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, much more in common than they have with London and the South East. Now, the decision to leave the EU was made against this background of increasing and asymmetrical devolution and the debate about what has become known as the English question. This presents a challenge. Since the devolved legislatures were established in 1999, the EU has been the constant context in the UK's constitutional architecture. Now, while most of the powers returning from the EU will return to the UK government in Westminster, many would pass automatically to the devolved administrations and legislatures. This could lead to some further legislative divergence that would undermine policies necessary for the United Kingdom as a whole. The debate about how this should be managed has further exposed the weakness of the institutional relations between the various governments and legislatures of the United Kingdom. And indeed, it actually exposes that how little developed the architecture is between the four parts, the four legislative administrative parts of the devolution settlement. Under the UK's reserved power models of devolution, all powers not expressly reserved to Westminster are devolved to that nation, and the division of powers can be regarded as essentially binary. This means that if nothing were done when the UK leaves the EU, powers over areas of EU competence, such as environment and farming or fishing, not expressly reserved to the UK Parliament, would automatically flow to the devolved administrations. There are 111 such powers identified that would return to Scotland, 64 to Wales and 141 to Northern Ireland. These include areas which are naturally fall under the joint competence of a UK government and the devolved administrations, like agriculture, fisheries and the environment. As I've already indicated, if EU powers which are not reserved to the UK Parliament return in the first instance to the devolved administrations, this could lead over time to policy and legislative divergence in areas that could undermine the UK internal market. Although the number of powers returning from the EU that fall within the devolved areas of competence is relatively limited, we're talking about a small minority of those powers, such divergence could be extremely damaging. Now, I've forgotten to do my slides. That's the asymmetrical, the timeline that's created the asymmetrical devolution. Where are we? These are examples of automatically reserved powers, automatically devolved powers. I gather everybody's been having this problem. It's not just me.
Point it at the screen.
Oh, right, point it at the screen. Okay. Those are the numbers of powers returning. Now, the government, this is about Clause 11 of the EU Withdrawal Bill. The government initially proposed that these powers should return to Westminster in the first instance, and that they could then later be passed back to the devolved administrations once common frameworks on the areas of common policy have been decided. Provision for this was made under Clause 11 of the EU Withdrawal Bill. This would have prevented the devolved legislatures from modifying any EU retained law on any of the reserved powers in the interim, regardless of what would otherwise have been devolved. On 13th of July 2017, immediately after the bill was published, the First Minister of Wales, Kalman Jones, and the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, issued a joint statement which described the bill as a naked power grab. The Scottish and Welsh governments subsequently also published legislative consent memoranda stating that neither government would present legislative consent motions for the EU Withdrawal Bill in its present form, and these are provided for in the Devolution Acts if the UK government is going to legislate in devolved areas. Now, the government's not ignored these threats. You may have read David Lidington's speech last week in which he outlined the government's proposal to amend the EU Withdrawal Bill to make it clear that while frameworks are being agreed, the presumption would be that the powers returning from the EU sit at the devolved level. There would be a pause while the governments design and implement the required common frameworks, and where powers need to be part of a UK-wide framework, the government would retain the ability to legislate to achieve this. This would seem to be a sensible compromise, and it would mean that powers would return in the first instance to the devolved level and try and avoid the offence of the so-called power grab. I mean, when they say power grab, these are powers that the devolved legislatures have never actually held because they've been retained by the European Union. However, there are still objections from devolved governments. As well as deciding to whom powers should return in the first instance, consideration must be given to how decisions should be made regarding whether or not UK-wide frameworks are needed in specific policy areas and how these frameworks will work in practice. On a visit to the Scottish Parliament last year, and you've no idea what an innovation it is for a select committee from Westminster to go and formally visit one of the devolved legislatures in this country, it was suggested to us that a UK Standing Advisory Committee on Powers returning from the EU, modelled on the Kalman Commission on Scottish Devolution, might be a good means of deciding where powers should rest. Part of the cultural problem here is usually there has been an enormous amount of discussion before there's been any amendment to any of the devolved settlements. The EU withdrawal bill bounced out of the blue in that respect. There was very little discussion before that bill was published. The Kalman Commission is an example of a body that deliberated at length before the latest round of increased devolution. Members of the Kalman Commission included representatives of each of the main political parties, industry, and different areas of public life, and the Commission took evidence from a wide range of people and organisations. If designed well, a new body modelled along the similar lines, but for the whole of the UK, could have provided, and I now use the past tense because time is slipping past, an effective means of devising a coherent system of devolved, shared and reserved powers which would enjoy the confidence of all sides. Does it say what number the slide that is? No, it's not 68. That's your number, not my number. Where shared frameworks are necessary, it has been suggested that these frameworks should be modelled on the fiscal framework already established by the Scotland Act 2016. Beyond this example, shared powers and shared policy making have historically been avoided in the UK due to the challenges they present at a constitutional level and the need for more effective intergovernmental machinery. However, if we are to avoid tying ourselves into knots by trying to force all policy into this inherited binary model of devolution, and if we are to avoid a situation in which devolved policy areas increasingly impinge on central government, we will need to adopt shared policy in key areas. How this could be done must be examined, and the experience of this in the 2016 Scotland Act could be instructive. Right. The debate about powers returning from the EU that fall within the devolved competence has exposed these failings in the devolution settlement in the UK. Devolution is in many ways a good thing. It allows decisions to be taken closer to the people they affect and by individuals with a better understanding of local issues and context. It encourages political engagement. The Brexit vote was driven to a significant extent by the same kind of aspirations, by people's wish to regain a feeling of control, by a wish to bring decision-making and accountability closer to home. It should drive devolution and decentralisation, both within England and to the devolved nations as a way, albeit not the only way, of achieving this. Another benefit of devolution in the UK is that it has allowed the cultural identity of the devolved nations to be much more strongly expressed in political terms. In Northern Ireland in particular, it has accommodated variations in identity and degrees of difference. Citizens can be British or Irish or both. This is positive and important. However, there is no consensus about where the process of devolution should end. Devolution was always described by its founders under Tony Blair as a process rather than as a settlement. In Scotland, the 2014 referendum failed to resolve this question, and arguments about Scottish independence continue. If the instinct of successive governments since 1999 to devolve increasing powers continues, there is a risk that the union of the four nations could be undermined even unintentionally. Where does the balance lie? how much constitutional diversity can the UK bear without undermining the political solidarity and constitutional integrity that underpins its existence as a union? As well as asking what powers should be devolved and where this balance lies, we must also ask what institutions and mechanisms exist to bind the UK together in the face of territorial divergence. And how can positive relationships be fostered between the UK government and Parliament in the Westminster and the devolved administrations and legislatures? These questions are especially important if we are to see more shared frameworks and policy making in the future. And it's instructive to consider what institutional arrangements the EU has for shared competencies, for which there is no parallel for shared competencies within the United Kingdom. There's a Committee of the Regions, for example. We have no equivalent of the Committee of the Regions for the United Kingdom. In its report entitled, I should say our report, The Future of the Union, Part 2, Interinstitutional Relations in the UK, published in 2016, PACAC found that the quality of intergovernmental and interparliamentary relations in the UK is poor. The quality of interinstitutional relations has also lagged behind the constitutional developments as the devolution of considerable further powers to the devolved parliaments and the corresponding need for greater cooperation between the devolved legislatures and the Parliament in Westminster has not been met by the development of any formal procedures to facilitate this cooperation. Cooperation has instead taken place largely through informal channels, which are far too dependent upon the personalities and the relationships of those involved. While intra-civil service relations are generally considered more effective due to the continuation of the shared civil service in Great Britain at least, there remain concerns that the devolved administrations are too often treated as an afterthought by Whitehall. And there's a very famous apocryphal note, a story, that a civil servant in a Whitehall department has a post-it note above their desks. It says, "Don't forget the DAs," which is the derogatory term which civil servants use for the devolved administrations. Otherwise, without the post-it note, they would be forgotten. In the light of the devolution of further powers in recent years, as well as the UK's impending departure from the EU, which, as discussed, will result in many EU powers passing to the devolved administrations, and the need to establish common frameworks in certain policy areas, it is essential that this is addressed. So, improving intergovernmental relations. In our report, we recommended that the Joint Ministerial Council, known as the JMC, should remain at the heart of the UK's intergovernmental relations, playing an important coordinating role and facilitating effective government. The amount of time set aside for JMC business should, however, be increased to enable issues of concern to be discussed in detail and more often. Efforts should be made to ensure that the interests and concerns of all the devolved administrations are heard, for example, by rotating responsibility for hosting JMC meetings and for setting the agenda, rather like the Council of Ministers in the European Union, dare I say. Since all of the devolved legislatures are now responsible for some aspects of tax, and Holyrood and Stormont both have welfare responsibilities, we also recommended that the four administrations should establish new subcommittees of the JMC focused on tax, welfare and financial settlements between the four governments. This would allow areas of mutual concern to be discussed and models of best practice in these areas to be more effectively shared. It would also be a step towards the establishment of a more purposeful, policy-relevant model of intergovernmental relations. To support this, we recommended that there should be a formal mechanism for representatives, departments of states and their counterparts in the devolved administrations to meet at least once a year to discuss policy matters. Additionally, within each department of state, there should be a minister acting as a designated contact point for the devolved administrations. We welcome the government's decision to establish a new JMC committee on EU negotiations called JMC-EN, They give them such friendly names. However, we caution that this must not preclude further consideration regarding how the JMC and its subcommittees can best be structured. It is important that these support the government in Westminster to develop a UK-wide approach in policy areas in which the devolved administrations have an interest. There is merit, for example, in the idea of creating agriculture and fisheries and economic affairs subcommittees. Such committees could either be formal subcommittees under the general coordination of JMCN or JMCP, or could be meetings of the JMCN in a functional sector-specific format in a fashion similar to the Council of Ministers meetings in the EU. Our final key recommendation in relation to the JMC was that the JMC Secretariat's capacity should be enhanced so that the JMC can call upon the advice and support of shared technical staff with expertise in key policy areas. Now, interparliamentary relations. We recommended a number of steps be taken to enhance interparliamentary relations in the UK. Amending standing orders to enable all committees of the House of Commons to meet jointly with any specified committee of any of the three devolved legislatures. Increasing the transparency of meetings between the Speaker of the House of Commons and the presiding officers of the devolved legislatures by providing written notice and written summaries of these quadrilaterals. Supporting informal interparliamentary cooperation among clerks and other officials, for example, through training and secondment, and to a degree that happens already. Although not something we looked at in PACAC's inquiry, as it wasn't in existence when our report was published, the work of the Inter-Parliamentary Forum on Brexit has subsequently been established. This comprises the Brexit-focused committees from the House of Commons, the Lords, Wales and Scotland, who come together to discuss Brexit issues. It's amazing how much we find we have in common across all the political parties. And were it not for the deadlock in Northern Ireland, it would also include the relevant committees from Stormont. We hope this sets a positive example. In PACAC's further inquiry on devolution and exiting the EU that we are currently undertaking, PACAC has also heard that there should be some form of parliamentary scrutiny of intergovernmental relations. PACAC will look into this further as its inquiry progresses. There is a Council of Europe comprising parliamentarians across the whole of Europe. Why isn't there a parliamentary council of some kind of the United Kingdom? A final personal thought on interparliamentary relations is that legislation should provide that any committee of any parliament can meet in its own building of any other parliament. You'd be surprised, if we go to Scotland, we have to meet in a different building and we have to pay a large sum of money to pay for the necessary audio-visual facilities that would be available very cheaply if we were able to meet in the Scottish Parliament. I'm not aware that the United Kingdom Parliament offers a particularly warm welcome to the other parliaments, but that should change. Wales is setting a very good example down in Cardiff. Now, slide 11. Civil service relations. PACAC found that although the situation is better and has improved recently, too many officials and departments continue to treat the devolved governments as an afterthought, as I was saying. To supplement progress, Whitehall departments have made in engaging officials from devolved administrations in UK policy formation. PACAC therefore recommended that every Whitehall department should implement procedures to ensure such engagement takes place. PACAC also recommended that the UK Governance Group should task governments to report on reviews and lessons learned every year, and that should explore how devolution awareness can be enhanced by civil service training and programmes, civil service training being a much bigger issue in its own right. In its response to our report, the government unfortunately did not accept the majority of our recommendations. However, PACAC is continuing to look at these issues and, as I've already mentioned, is carrying out this further inquiry. This present inquiry will reinforce the recommendations we made previously and will put them in the context of future devolution in the UK and why effective and lasting mechanisms for coordinating work between Westminster and the devolved administrations is so important. Mechanisms for dialogue and coordination between Westminster and the devolved administrations is absolutely essential, and we must put this in place. And also, we must explore where the devolved parts of England fit into this arrangement more consciously. I'd like to make some final comments on the question of trust. Trust between the people that make up the different administrations and parliaments in the United Kingdom. Because actually the only purpose of having these institutional arrangements is that the personal relationships and the trust builds up in the future. For the reasons I've outlined, as well as the way the government has conducted the Brexit negotiations, trust between the different administrations is depressingly low. The devolved administrations have too frequently felt that their interests and concerns haven't been heard or understood, the manner in which the withdrawal bill was published, for example. The relations have been consequently poor. This has given too many opportunities to those who might want to capitalise on distrust, without mentioning any names. And this situation must be addressed. If taken, the steps I have outlined would help to do this. However, no matter what formal arrangements are put in place, if they are not predicated on perhaps a little bit more mutual respect and a genuine desire to engage, goodwill and trust will not be promoted, and strong and effective relationships will not be achieved. And the context in which I often present the committee's work is regardless of how we finish up in the British Isles, building up that trust and understanding between the four parts of the United Kingdom is going to be essential. Some believe Brexit presents a risk to the cohesion of the UK. I think that I may be a slide behind. I'm guessing. No, I'll go back. Whoops. Some believe Brexit represents a risk to the cohesion of the UK. However, it also presents an opportunity to address the glaring gaps in the present devolution arrangements, including the lack of interinstitutional machinery. This is essential in the light of the increased coordination that will be needed between Westminster and the devolved governments on shared competencies. It is essential that these omissions in the present arrangements are addressed, and I very much hope the government will embrace the opportunity presented by Brexit to do this. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for a very detailed and really interesting presentation. I'll open with a question and then go to the floor. Just to ask, given that the government did reject most of the recommendations of the PACAP report, what do you think now would be a most convincing gesture from Westminster towards rebuilding trust and goodwill?
Well, first of all, why did the government reject all this now? Because it's a lot of, Whitehall is very overloaded with Brexit alongside everything else. And the legislative timetable, if one was to put JMC structures into a legislative framework, there's no time for legislation of that nature. So I think a lot of this resistance is just, we're too busy to think about this now. I don't think it's necessarily our objective to lambast the government for that. We're happy that there is now conversation going on around this subject, which is part of the progress that we need. What the government is doing, of course, is thinking about making conciliatory noises about Clause 11 of the EU withdrawal bill and demonstrating it is willing to enter into dialogue. I'm sure when the House of Lords consider this, the Minister will make very conciliatory noises, and I'm sure there will be a change to the clause. If the devolved legislatures persist in threatening withholding of their legislative consent motions, despite everything the government tries to do to conciliate, I would suggest that the political crisis that they're trying to engineer will look like a political crisis they're trying to engineer, and therefore will be of less significance than it would otherwise be.
Thank you for your answer. Professor Bogdanov.
Van Bogdanor, we should be grateful to you and your committee for highlighting this important problem in relationships between the different parts of the United Kingdom, what you call the architecture, a problem which I think and you think is highlighted by Brexit. And you're saying, and I think you're right, that the problem's been in the ad hoc and unplanned way in which we've devolved powers. And I think actually the Scotland Act of 2016 was an example of that, because it was proposed in a mood of panic. Now, the answer to the committee, as I understand it, is to strengthen an intergovernmental layer. And you say rightly this isn't easy to achieve when there isn't consensus. And that's difficult enough to achieve between the Conservative and Labour parties, and even more difficult to achieve with separatist parties in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So it may be insoluble. But if you do succeed in achieving it, don't you create another problem of really creating a third layer of unaccountable government, where you have endless buck passing of the sort you get in federal systems, with that third layer of government when no one knows who's responsible for decisions? And wouldn't a better path be for Westminster to lay down not a constitution, but a charter of principles of what needs to be kept at the centre? For example, what divergence in agricultural subsidies is it reasonable to expect between four parts of the United Kingdom? What divergences in healthcare? What divergences in social care? And so on and so on. And to lay down a charter of principles. And from that point of view, when Brexit gives an impetus, couldn't it be a constitutional moment to really rationalise the whole devolution process? And might that not be a better path than, in effect, creating another layer of government?
I don't really accept it's creating another layer of government. It's where things would be agreed, but the decisions wouldn't actually be made and implemented from the JMC or from an Inter-Parliamentary Council. I also think that the day we stepped down the devolution path, we stepped into a far messier system of government in our country. And you look at any decentralised system of government, and it is inherently messy, and a great deal of time is spent trying to deal with that mess. Whether you go to Canada or Spain or the United States or Australia, there is always a contention between the component parts of a federation and the federal construct, even where you lay it down in a written constitution. I think the primary objective now is to highlight just how little opportunity there is to develop relationships, friendships, between the different component parts of our constitution. What is striking is when we go to Cardiff and we go to Edinburgh, how easy it is to sit down, because, I mean, I'm talking about parliamentarians, because we're all in that tribe, politicians, how easy it is to sit down with people from completely different parties and talk informally, and it's the informal conversations that really need to take place, and to discover how much common understanding there really is. There's much more tub thumping in public than goes on in private. What we want is more to go on in private, so that the people who are trying to stir it up in public have people tapping them on the shoulder and say, yeah, you've said all that now, let's get on with it. And that's how the Clause 11 problem will be resolved, in my view. So I don't entirely agree with you, but I'm very flattered by your support for the work of the committee, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you very much.
We have a question here at the front.
Thank you. My name's John Yeoman. I'd like to take up the issue of Northern Ireland for three reasons. The first is, of course, that the Northern Ireland Executive has not been functioning for over 1 year, so there's a clear logjam there. Adding to that, of course, the province did vote in favour of staying in the EU, and last but by no means least, the matter of the land border.
I think it's extremely unfortunate that the Belfast Agreement is not functioning as intended. It's got nothing to do with Brexit. That all originated from a row about Arlene Foster and her responsibility for an green energy scheme whose costs ran out of control and led to a breakdown in trust within the joint administration. And then, for various reasons, various cultural differences have become very much put to the fore, and they're pretty irreconcilable. I don't agree with any suggestion that the Belfast Agreement has somehow had its day, and incidentally Owen Paterson has been grievously misrepresented on that point. Let me just make that clear. But I think we must be patient and hope that it will resolve. It may resolve more easily after Brexit is resolved. Maybe it will resolve more easily after the elections take place in the Republic. On the second point, which was
on the question of the fact that the majority of the provinces wanted to stay in.
Well, I mean, it may seem a tiresome technicality, but it was a United Kingdom referendum, and the last time Ireland voted, they wanted to be part of the United Kingdom, and the same goes for Scotland, we let them vote in our referendum, and they helped decide the result for the whole of the United Kingdom. So I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that the province voted a different way, but it is not constitutionally decisive. On the question of the Irish border, again, I mean, what is extraordinary about this issue is how I think it will prove in the end to be something rather of a phony issue. The reason being, only about 5% of Northern Ireland's output is transmitted across the Northern Ireland border. Difficult to get figures on this, but I'm told that's a reliable figure. You could probably list the non-SME businesses at less than 100 who regularly export or import across the Irish border. That represents the vast majority of the value of the traffic across the border. A lot of what goes across the border is regular repeat traffic, which is familiar to people who watch what happens around the border. I agree with Bertie Ahern, who gave an interview on the Today programme some months ago now, when he said, look, this can all be policed away from the frontier. We can improve the technology around the convenience of pre-booking shipments across a customs frontier, and then we probably just turn a blind eye to the smuggling that we can't detect, just as we already turn the blind eye to the smuggling on excise duty or VAT fraud or things like that, because we regard it as a far greater risk to the peace process in Northern Ireland to put infrastructure at the border than to mind about the relatively minor infringements of the law across that border. Now, I think this argument was very much strengthened by a paper submitted to the European Parliament by Lars Carlson, who is now the Secretary General of the World Customs Organization. He should know. While his paper did not envisage the minimum of barriers at the frontier, in fact, the kind of technology he's promoting could be an example of how you could, in the end, get rid of a lot of customs frontiers in many places in the world. And of course, this is what the EU Commission is really worried about, is that even if we have a customs frontier at Dover and the Channel ports and for the Channel Tunnel, we may not actually need to do any checking when people get on and off the ferries or get on and off the Channel Tunnel trains. The checking may actually be done away from the frontier in the same way. And this is a great inconvenience to the argument that the Commission wants to present in these negotiations, that somehow if we leave the European Union, we're stepping off the cliff edge into some administrative nightmare. Of course, we're not. So finally, I would add that when Varadkar has had his general election and has stopped taunting the Unionists in Northern Ireland as part of his ingratiation strategy with the Green vote in the Republic of Ireland, realism may prevail. And in the end, Who wants to put infrastructure at the border? I don't know anybody who does. If the European Union are stupid enough to force the Republic to do it, I think they would be subject to so much criticism. It will prove to be unnecessary, and I don't think it will happen.
We're not going to have a debate on this now. Because people didn't come here to hear that, but you're factually wrong on many points, Bernard, with all due respect.
I'm sorry?
Yes, you are. But we can talk about it at the coffee break, maybe.
Okay, sure.
Do you want to?
I'm not chairing this, you are.
Well, suffice to say, just to pick up the fundamental point about the border being a phony issue. And it's really not, with all due respect. The border is managed to be more or less resolved through the 98 agreement. So if you put the border back there on the table as an issue for debate, most particularly if you're talking about UK-Ireland relations and what the borders between Northern Ireland and UK, Ireland and Ireland, you make it a very live political issue. And it's very, very dangerous to dismiss that. Also, it's not a phony issue. It's a very real issue in terms of trade. The customs rules are ones you can't choose to take or to ignore. You have to enforce them. And the last point about technology. Technology is just a tool. Technology doesn't get you away from the need that you have to enforce that border. And I've done a lot of work on border security technology, and I sat beside Lars Carlson when he presented his report to the EP, because I presented the same report to the same committee of the European Parliament. And technology, you still need people on the ground to enforce that. You still need inspection points. And it's the friction that will be created in very real terms for people whose lives and whose peace that they enjoy depends on being able to cross that border very smoothly and easily with no fuss whatsoever. That's putting a real, that's really opening up a huge amount, both politically, symbolically, materially. And the idea that smuggling is not significant, you're basically saying to legitimate borders on the northern side of the border that actually we're going to disregard the smuggling issue. It's just going to be a minor issue that doesn't really matter. It matters for people who are trying to trade across the border and make their livelihoods across the border.
Well, I'm very grateful that you've addressed that in the way you have. When I say it's a phony issue, I don't mean that the border is not a very, very sensitive issue in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is the way it's been raised as a proxy, as a lever in this negotiation. And secondly, I would just say that it's not about ignoring smuggling. It's about policing smuggling away from the border, just as we do now. There is smuggling across that border now, and we police that away from the border. What I'm also saying is that the kind of smuggling that we will be policing away from the border will be very minimal compared to the quantity of traffic that will legitimately be crossing the border. So I think to make a religion out of customs frontiers is what the European Union is trying to do in order to strong-arm the United Kingdom into some kind of agreement that we don't want to accept. I thought it was, I mean, if you talk about stirring it up, suggesting that there should be a customs frontier down the Irish Sea as an alternative, or as a solution to this problem, was about as inflammatory as could be imagined. I think the European Union has behaved very irresponsibly. What we have consistently said, the government has consistently said, is we don't want any infrastructure at the frontier between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, end of story, and I think that's the responsible position to take. But I'm very grateful that you raised the points you felt so strongly about.
I do. One last thing, there isn't an election coming up. Radker isn't trying to get votes. There's no election in the south.
Well, there's not one yet, but there will be.
Anand, did you have a question? Okay, question here.
Thank you very much. Keith Best, as Bernard knows, I'm Secretary of the European Movement, and he probably wouldn't expect any support from me at this stage. But of course, there is one scenario in which there may be very little trade moving across the border in Northern Ireland. And that emanated from a discussion I had with Daniel Mulhall, who you will recall was the former Irish ambassador here, who's now gone off to Washington. And in that conversation, shortly before he went to Washington, he expressed concern, obviously, about the border. And although, Bernard, what you say is very little goods come from Northern Ireland into the Republic, something like 80% of Irish exports go across that border, not always destined for the UK, but destined for further points within the EU. And of course, they come through Fishguard and Holyhead. He was saying that if we end up with any kind of significant border, particularly a hard border, then the Irish Republic is going to have to look seriously about bypassing Britain altogether. And although it's more expensive, actually sending ships out of Dublin to go all the way around to European ports and just miss out Britain altogether. I don't know if that's something you thought about, or if it's anything you would wish to comment upon.
Well, if the Republic of Ireland is, it's very good to see you, Keith. If the Republic of Ireland is in a different customs area from the rest of from the United Kingdom, and the exports from the Republic of Ireland are simply going through the United Kingdom, on any international basis, they would simply be bonded through. They wouldn't enter the United Kingdom, pay duty, and then reclaim the duty on exit. It would be bonded through the United Kingdom. I don't anticipate that would be an issue, but I think people are trying to make it an issue, and the Irish government is trying to make it an issue as part of the negotiations. I think it's all rather unfortunate.
And
first, Bernard, thanks for coming and doing this. I'm going to move away from Northern Ireland for a moment.
Thank goodness.
And just ask a question that relates more to Scotland and Wales. And it's a question I asked Lord Heseltine this morning, and he, of course, said there isn't an answer to this under a Brexit scenario. But the question is, how do you square the circle of respecting the devolution settlement and maintaining the UK internal market?
Well, there's been a UK internal market since the Act of Union in respect of Scotland, so that's 350 years. I think I would cite the evidence that we received from Nigel Smith. Now, Nigel Smith was the chairman of Scotland Forward in 1997 and led the pro-devolution campaign in Scotland that led to the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. In his evidence, he actually says there is no power grab. And the reality is that the powers that are the subject of this dispute were never actually devolved. I mean, another witness, the professor of constitutional law from, I think, Aberdeen, in the previous inquiry, he gave us the evidence, and he referred orally to the idea that these powers were only ever notionally devolved. So I think we plea for a rather more grown-up conversation. We are not. There is no stealing of powers from the devolved administrations, because these powers were never being exercised by the devolved administrations. They're certainly going to have more say over these matters now that they are going to be domiciled in the United Kingdom rather than in Brussels. But of course, I recognise that the real problem here is the nationalists particularly, and there is a nationalist tinge to much of the Labour Party in Scotland and Wales as well, and maybe even in bits of the Conservative Party, I'm being very frank here, that there is more trust, there has been more trust of EU institutions from those devolved administrations and parliaments than there is of the Westminster system. That's something we've got to deal with. But in reality, there has been no power grab. It is a fiction. It is a slogan. It is not a reality.
Tony, Professor Travis.
I mean, there are a number of issues raised by the UK's vote to leave the EU other than leaving the EU, I think by common consent, and many of those have been discussed here today and will be discussed for a long time to come. I mean, I'd be interested to see which you think are the most important of those other votes, of those other factors, and what you see the government trying to do about them as we speak. So just to take the one that was discussed before this session, parts of the country feeling that the economy, the global economy, doesn't work for them, and that they've been left behind, and there's a big imbalance in the UK economy. So we just take that as one of them, but do add others. Do you see the government acting to do something about that in parallel with all the Brexit preparations?
I think, let's be honest, there is both a political and an administrative bandwidth problem. But I think the government's implementation of an industrial strategy, continuing with themes like the Northern Powerhouse, they're clearly intended to address this. But I heard a comment being made at the end of the last session that a lot of these problems are structural to mature economies dealing with globalization. I think by far the most important thing we need to do is make sure our own people are better educated to participate in the workforce that we require, and that we restore the work ethic among some of the communities that have been long-term deprived of employment opportunities. I think one of the most encouraging trends in recent years is the rapid decline in the number of children that have been brought up in workless households. Now, we hear a lot about how relative poverty has increased, that low wages have been very stubbornly static, but I think it's going to it will be a great improvement if far fewer children are being brought up in workless households than there were, say, 10 or 15 years ago. And that itself will generate a more employable workforce, and one that will be more engaged in the economies in which they live. I don't think there's instant structural or expenditure things that governments can do. I mean, let's face it, as you have so often explained yourself, you know, it's almost as though there's a direct, an inverse correlation. The more money the government spends in a certain area to try and bring up the economic well-being of that area, the more that stubbornly behind that economic area can prove to be. We have tried to equalise through government expenditure. I don't think that's not the way. I don't think that's not the long-term solution. You can spend on infrastructure, you can spend on training, but you can't actually make jobs appear just by spending government money in depressed areas. I think we need to think much more imaginatively. And also, I do think there are great opportunities with the modern economy and the internet economy, that to what extent proximity to the great cities is going to be the driver of economic opportunity is now an open question. You could run an engineering business down an ADSL line. There are far more dispersed economies in much bigger countries than ours, where they manage to disperse economic activity. I thought about this a very great deal when I was for 3 years Shadow Secretary of State for the regions. There are no instant answers, but I think it's something we go on struggling with, and we should go on struggling with. I think technology and education are the drivers of this. And one other thing I would say is, again, something I think a view you would share. To what extent how do we imagine the modern city? We think of the City of London as Greater London. Well, actually, the London as a global city kind of stretches from Bristol up to the Midlands and Cambridge, and you know, everybody's in that orbit. And the problem we've got in our country in particular, London is so gargantuan as an economic unit that the dispersed, what do you do with the Scottish Central Belt or Northern Ireland or Newcastle, which is sort of out of reach of the prosperity of that city? Well, HS2 is a very expensive but perhaps necessary way of enlarging access to this mega global city. But are we irreversibly in a world of mega global cities rather than of nations being economic units? It's a huge subject, this, but the idea that a few government initiatives is going to resolve it, it's going to be a tough one.
Okay, we've got time for one last question.
Hi, Ian McWhirter from the Sunday Herald. I just wanted to congratulate you, Bernard, on your admirable candour about the powers of the Scottish Parliament, or rather, as you said, the lack of them, because you were saying that essentially it's a fantasy. They didn't really exercise those powers, only as virtuous as being part of the EU. But that will come as a surprise to a lot of people in the Scottish Parliament over powers such as animal welfare, food standards, control of pesticides, as well as agriculture and fisheries, fracking, GM crops. You can understand why people in the Scottish Parliament are a little concerned at the prospect of these being removed from the remit of the Scottish Parliament, and also for what is really a fundamental change in the Constitution of the United Kingdom. Because as you rightly said, under the Scotland Act 1998, these powers repatriated from Brussels do automatically, as a matter of law, go straight to the Scottish Parliament. So any way you look at it, this is a fantastic change, surely, in the UK Constitution, and directly affects the status and standing of the Scottish Parliament.
Well, do you know, I haven't been in many Scottish pubs recently, but I'm sure they talk of nothing else except this.
You'd be surprised. You would.
In fact, I hear a slight attempt to parody what I was saying in your question. The answer is, if the SNP want to make a massive row in it, they'll try. But what's the point? Because we've all got to get on and find a solution to this problem. And I reiterate, I don't know about the particular powers you mentioned, but the Scottish Parliament's never been in charge of the common agricultural policy, as far as I've been aware. And for the United Kingdom Parliament to retain powers to create a common agricultural policy is not taking a power away from the Scottish Parliament, only in the most theoretical constitutional terms. So there is something of a manufactured dispute about this. And I say this, if the SNP carry on threatening withholding legislative consent motions, they will simply devalue that instrument of political influence. Because if we're talking law, constitutional law, the legislative consent motions are of no constitutional legal significance whatsoever, because the clause in the Scotland Act, which provides for these legislative consent motions, is not binding in law. And it would be a shame if they throw away the influence of the Scottish Parliament by exercising this veto when the veto doesn't really exist. But if that's what they want to do, that's what they'll do.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Bernard, thank you very much
for
your
speech.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.